Welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. We'll continue with our coverage of the Washington Department of Corrections. Washington State Penitentiary is located in Walla, Washington, with an operating capacity of almost 2,500. It houses minimum, medium, close, and max security prisoners. During the 1880s, Washington's territorial legislature sought to build a prison to satisfy requirements for eventual statehood. Walla city government began lobbying for a permanent institution, and Levi Ankeny, a local wealthy businessman, donated 160 acres for the site in 1886. On May 11, 1887, the first 10 prisoners arrived from the old Seco institution. 2 prisoners escaped shortly after it opened on July 4, 1887. I guess took Independence Day literally, but only made it a few miles before being recaptured. Since that time, there have been several more escapes, including a seized supply train in 1891 and a riot that left 9 dead in 1934. 10 prisoners tunneled under the wall in 1955, and John Allen Lamb sawed his way out in 1997. The penitentiary has been known as several names, such as the Hill, the Joint, the Walls, and Big Red for its red brick walls, and simply the Pen. My grandpa Gabriel did time there from the mid-1940s through early 1950s for a manslaughter conviction. I recall my grandfather saying that he could never put hot sauce on his eggs or eat huevos rancheros after his time there because shortly after he was processed into the prison, he was sitting down at a dining hall table, getting ready to eat his breakfast, when a guy next to him was stabbed in the chest and blood spurted out all over his eggs. Liberal Governor Dixie Lee Ray was in office in the 1970s when she went along with prison reform movements sweeping the nation after serious incidents such as the Attica riot in New York that killed multiple inmates and corrections officers, most of whom were killed by the National Guard when the facility was retaken. Inmate self-governing bodies were set up at the pen, which included clubs for different races and groups, such as the Washington State Penitentiary Motorcycle Association, also known as the Barkers Club, who, believe it or not, were allowed to ride their bikes out on the big yard, and were allowed to have big banquets with other biker clubs attending, outside visitors, bands, girls, and everything else you can imagine. When I was working at El Centro de la Raza around 1976, I rode along with Blue Martin, who was part of the Pinto program at the Central, to visit convicts at McNeil Island, as well as the Washington State Penitentiary Chicano Club. As I recall, this occurred on Cinco de Mayo, and I did not know it, but Blue had keistered some heroin that he brought into the facility. We were in a room where the Chicano Club was, and guards were not allowed entrance. There was Mexican food, and they were playing Mexican music for the fiesta when Old Blue pulled out his package and they started shooting up Chiva right there. I recall I was freaking out, but could not show any worry or fear. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. And I talked more about it, as well as details about my grandfather's charge and his time at the joint, in my autobiography, Life and Times of a Local. The inmate self-government experiment was a disaster, per the majority of experts. The years of 1977 to 1981 were a tumultuous time at the pen, which was experimenting with giving inmates more freedom and access inside of the walls. In fact, some inmates had their own keys to parts of the prison. Correctional Officer Jim Hartford was assigned to the Walla County Courthouse on April 5th, 1977, during the trial of 2 inmates charged with assault. While on break, Hartford picked up a cigarette lighter from under the table. When he tested it, it exploded. It had been booby-trapped with match heads. Hartford lost most of his fingers on his right hand that day. Over the next 4 days, there was documented retaliation by corrections officers in the segregation unit. And on April 10th, 1977, inmates set fire to the chapel and ransacked the inmate store. Because it happened on Easter Sunday, it became known as the Easter Riot. The resulting lockdown lasted 46 days and resulted in dramatic changes at the penitentiary. After a period of liberal reforms, Jim Spaulding took over as superintendent in 1978 and implemented major changes, such as restructuring and remodeling of the prison to exert more control over inmate movements. He also relocated several offenders deemed to be problems. and moved for the removal of the green space, also called the Lifers Park or People's Park, within the prison walls. In May of 1979, a hostage situation and ensuing police response led to a riot. June of 1979, a corrections officer was murdered, leading to a months-long lockdown and a wave of shakedowns and crackdowns on inmate activities. On June 15, 1979, Sergeant William Cross was murdered by inmates. The attack occurred in an extension of the People's Park area. He was stabbed 5 times, with one wound severing his aorta. Cross's death marked the longest lockdown in the history of Washington State prisons. Later on, inmate George Simmons was convicted of his death and sentenced to life in prison. He later committed suicide. On July 7th, 1979, just weeks after Sergeant Cross's murder, Washington State prison inmates rioted again in 8 Wing, which they destroyed that night. It caused about $10,000 in damage, but no serious injuries were reported. 12 inmates who were believed to be ringleaders were removed from the general population and faced charges of inciting a riot. Multiple weapons were found after all of these incidents. I understand that disturbance was touched off when prison officials refused to release an inmate leader from the segregation unit. I think that may have been Ken Tuka, president of the Lifers Club, but I'm not 100% sure. On December 5th, 1978, Ken Tuka, Alvin Gilchrist, and inmate Arthur St. Peter attempted to escape via a tunnel that came out on the west wall between towers 3 and 4. They were immediately challenged by tower guards, but Gilchrist and Iktuka refused to stop and were shot. Gilchrist was wounded in the shoulder, and Iktuka was shot in the shoulder and leg. Peter stopped, and all 3 were taken into custody with assistance from the Walla Police Department. A loaded .38 caliber revolver was found at the exit to the tunnel, and a box of ammunition was found on inmate St. Peter. And his right-hand man was Al Gilchrist, and I interviewed both of them at the King County Jail. I've talked about how some of the prison gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs, etc., were running wild at that time, and straight-in prison gangs continue to be active today. In February 2002, a large disturbance involved the use of inmate weapons at the West Complex that involved security threat groups, or gangs. Over 60 officers responded, and several officers were hurt in that incident. Probably the most notable inmate housed at Walla in recent years was Gary Ridgway, a multi-murderer known as the Green River Killer, who pled guilty in 2003 to the murders of 48 women in order to avoid the death penalty. He was still incarcerated there as of December 2023, but is currently said to be dying. I did a video about him in my true crime series, as well as covering Kenneth Bianchi, one of 2 individuals who were part of the Hillside Strangler case. He was also housed at the Washington State Pen, and is still in the PC unit. He legally changed his name to Anthony D'Amato and is 74 years old. Ridgway and Bianchi were not alone. Robert Lee Yates, Jr. was known as the Spokane serial killer and the grocery bag killer. In 1975, he was hired by the Washington State Department of Corrections to work as an officer at the pen. He was also a former U.S. Army aircraft pilot who murdered at least 16 people, mostly female prostitutes, in eastern Washington between 1975 and 1998. On September 19, 2002, Yates was convicted of those murders and subsequently sentenced to death by lethal injection. The prison was the site of Washington State's death row, where executions were carried out until the Washington Supreme Court ruled the death penalty to be unconstitutional. October 11, 2018. During the 1990s, 2 men died via hanging when Washington resumed the death penalty. Wesley Allen Dodd requested to hang, and Charles Campbell refused to pick his method of execution, so that was defaulted to hanging. On the morning of September 17, 1981, a criminal named Mitchell Roop fatally shot bank tellers Candace Hemming and Twila Capone during the robbery of a Tumwater State Bank in Olympia. For that crime, he was given the death penalty, but his death sentence was overturned twice, including one time when a federal judge ruled that Roop was too heavy to hang. At that time, he was over 425 pounds, and I understand was eating a lot of candy bars and junk food in order to increase his weight and increase his defense that execution by hanging could cause him to be decapitated, which would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Roop was resentenced a 3rd time in the year 2000 by a new jury, but they deadlocked on 11-1 vote, and he ended up dying of liver disease at the pen in February 2006. Kyle Coburn Brown remained in death row around the same time, and his execution was carried out on September 10th, 2010, the last person to be executed in Washington State. Inmate Encarnacion Salas was charged with second-degree murder and accused of butchering inmate Gabe Cross in a shower at the Washington State Penitentiary on March 13, 2022. Cross had been sentenced to death for the 1999 murders of his wife and two stepdaughters in King County, Washington, in 2001. After his death sentence was commuted, when Washington Supreme Court deemed the use of the death penalty unconstitutional in 2018, Cross tried to die by suicide twice. Those failed attempts resulted in the fracturing of his skull and cervical column, injuring his brain and spine, and rendered himself a paraplegic. I don't have much information to share about the Olympic Correction Center in Forks, so I skipped that facility. Mission Creek Correction Center for Women in Belfair closed just a few months ago due to reduced female inmate populations in the state. There are a couple other facilities that are no longer in operation, such as Autumn View Correction Center and the Larch Correction Center, as well as the Pine Lodge Correction Center for women. McNeil Island Correction Center was considered to be part of the city of Steilacoom, located just south of Tacoma, but is pretty much shut down too, except for a few sex offenders. The island has a very interesting history. It was opened in 1875 by the U.S. government as a federal penitentiary. In the 1910s, the inmates included Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz. Mickey Cohen, 1930s Los Angeles mobster, was housed at McNeil as well as Alcatraz. Alan Karpus, the Depression-era gangster, who was part of the Mob Barker gang, got his nickname Creepy for his sinister smirk smile, and was also housed at McNeil. Roy Olmsted was an American bootlegger and former lieutenant for the Seattle Police Department, who was involved in alcohol smuggling from Canada during Prohibition while still serving in the department. He was housed at USP McNeil in the late 1920s and released in May 1931. Charles Manson was housed at Terminal Island in the 1950s, as well as McNeil Island in the early 1960s. Due to the high operation costs and maintenance needs, and many of the buildings needing serious renovations, in 1976, the Federal Bureau of Prisons declared the facility obsolete and decided to shut it down. At the same time, Washington State had a need for additional prison space. In 1981, they signed a lease to use the land, which was officially deeded to the state of Washington in 1984. We'll have the full interview posted shortly on this channel, but I recently discussed with correctional expert Dan Pacholke how the use of McNeil Island by Washington DLC came about. At that time, was McNeil Island still under the feds, or was it under Washington DOC?
No, McNeil Island was under Washington DOC, but we had, in '79, you had big problems in Walla Walla with a riot and some crowding issues, and Monroe in about 1980 had a problem, and they also had a consent decree on some double selling issues. So McNeil Island was one of the interventions they used in order to bleed off overcrowding from both the penitentiary and Monroe. And so, here we go. I mean, it opens up at the time.
In November 2010, the department announced its plans to close McNeil a year later in order to save at least $14 million. In 2021, Washington DLC announced that it would no longer be using solitary confinement as a punishment within state facilities. They stated that over the course of a year, DOC reviewed data on disciplinary segregation, also known as isolation or solitary confinement, to see if it was an effective method in addressing negative behavior. The review found that the use of solitary confinement was ineffective, and as of September 16, 2021, they stopped using it as a form of punishment. The Secretary of Corrections, Cheryl Strange, called the move historic. Now, having worked 30 years in corrections, I can state with confidence that solitary confinement does work, at least temporarily, in reducing harm to property and persons, including inmates harming themselves. But like Dan Pacholke, I do agree, long-term isolation can make a person worse. So they should not be on lockdown for extended periods of time. There should be a good behavior management program in place with buy-in on what it takes to get out of isolation by the offender, and with close and fair monitoring by corrections officials. Individuals should be enrolled in classes that can assist them in being successful in staying out of lockup. But like I said at the beginning of part 1, they have to want to change and want to get out of isolation. It cannot be forced upon them.
Group dynamics drive violence in prison. In Washington state, nearly half of all violent acts are committed by gangs or other groups. Home to many offenders with group affiliations, the West Complex at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla saw its share of the most serious violent acts.
Business as usual wasn't working. We were continuing to have violence, continuing to have multi-man fights, some serious staff assaults, uses of weapons.
So we had to cut down on the incident level. We had especially these large mega incidents where it cost us weeks of lockdown.
In late 2012, the Washington State Department of Corrections implemented a strategy called Operation Place Safety to reduce group violence in the penitentiary's West Complex. The program is the first of its kind. It takes the Operation Ceasefire model, which reduced violence on the streets of some of America's most violent neighborhoods, and applies it to a correctional setting.
It took a lot of work. It took us about 9 months of planning to be the first correctional system to try the ceasefire model in a prison setting.
Like in ceasefire, when someone commits a certain prohibited violent act, both they and the small group in which they affiliate face consequences.
Operation Place Safety is a non-traditional violence reduction strategy that targets the violent acts that pose the greatest risk to staff and offender safety. Staff assault, fight assault with a weapon, and a multi-offender fight or assault. If one of those things happens, we apply an enhanced response that includes privilege restrictions, things like confiscating personal shoes, TVs, reducing weightlifting privileges, and we apply those privilege restrictions to both the person who committed that violent act as well as the small cohesive group with whom they closely affiliate.
Data from the first full year of Operation Place Safety at the Washington State Penitentiary has indicated a reduction in those prohibited violent acts.
So having done Operation Place Safety for over a year, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about what it looks like to try the ceasefire model in a correctional setting. We've made some adjustments along the way, and I think we have seen some positive success. It looks like in the year following implementation, we've seen about a 50% reduction in prohibited violent acts, but we really do need some partnerships with external researchers and a more robust outcome evaluation to really see long-term impact.
These restrictions do have an impact on them. They're not meant to be punishment. They're not meant to be severe or long-lasting. It's only for a short time. But you know, when you get that direct feedback from the offenders that say, you know, taking a TV or taking shoes has an impact on their lives, then you can start to hopefully draw those connections between, you know, actions and consequences.
The Washington State model or California model or anywhere else in the U.S. was the magic answer for everything. Then inmates would never reoffend, and we know that is not the case. Many of them also have serious mental health issues, and I strongly believe we must stop using jails and prisons as mental institutions. The Washington Department of Corrections is currently led by a senior leadership team, with the Secretary of Department of Corrections being a cabinet-level position appointed by the governor. The current Secretary of Corrections is Tim Lang. There has been a lot of criticism over the department during the COVID epidemic, as well as 26 unexpected fatalities during the fiscal year ending in June 2024, with many of those being drug overdoses and suicide. I will say that the Washington Department of Corrections has tried to implement a lot of programs aimed at changing behavior, and I applaud that. I've recently spoke to some inmates involved in these programs with various levels of support, who in their opinion may disagree with the official DOC public relations line. Yes, they call me directly. Many of them have my number and talk to me about their issues or email me. And I'm always glad to give them my ear and give non-legal advice when they ask for it. Kind of makes me feel good that talking to them and making educational videos like this one still seem to make a difference in many people's lives. And with that, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.